I've never told anyone this story before. Not my family, not my closest friends, not even the search and rescue teams who found me 3 days later, half dead and babbling about impossible trails. But it's been eating at me for 2 years now, and I can't keep carrying this alone anymore. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a software engineer living in Portland, Oregon. I've been hiking the Pacific Northwest for 8 years, solo hiking specifically. I know that makes some people uncomfortable. A woman alone in the wilderness. But I've always felt safer in the forest than I do in the city. The mountains don't lie to you. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. I'd hiked the Mirror Lake Trail dozens of times. It's one of the most popular trails in Mount Hood National Forest. Well-maintained, clearly marked, moderate difficulty. Perfect for clearing your head after a brutal week of debugging code and sitting in fluorescent-lit conference rooms. That Saturday in October started like any other hiking day. I left Portland at sunrise, drove the familiar route up Highway 26, parked at the trailhead by 8 a.m. The morning was crisp, that perfect Pacific Northwest autumn weather, where the air tastes clean and the Douglas firs tower above you like ancient cathedrals. I'd packed my usual gear, plenty of water, trail mix, first aid kit, GPS device, fully charged phone, though I knew cell service would be spotty once I got deeper into the forest. About 2 miles in, I reached the junction where an unmarked side trail branches off to the left. I'd taken this detour probably 6 or 7 times before. It's not on any official trail map, just an old deer path that local hikers have worn into something resembling a trail. It cuts about half a mile off the route to Mirror Lake, winding through some of the most beautiful old-growth forest you'll ever see. Trees so massive you can't wrap your arms around them, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick it creates its own twilight even at midday. I turned onto the side trail without hesitation. I knew every root, every rock, every fallen branch along that path. Or at least, I thought I did. The first sign something was wrong came about 20 minutes in. The trail felt longer. I'm not talking about perception, about how time can feel stretched when you're alone in the woods. I mean the actual physical distance seemed to have expanded. I should have reached the distinctive fallen cedar that marks the halfway point, a massive tree that came down in a storm years ago, creating a natural bridge across a small creek. But I kept walking, and it never appeared. I checked my GPS. According to the device, I was moving in a straight line, making steady progress. But visually, nothing looked right. The forest around me seemed the same, unchanging. The same types of trees, the same undergrowth, the same filtered light. It was like walking through a loop of identical scenery. Maybe I'm just tired, I told myself. Maybe I took a wrong turn somewhere. But there hadn't been any turns. The trail was narrow and clear, winding between the trees in a way that left no room for confusion. That's when I saw the log. It was lying across the trail at an angle, forcing hikers to step over it. Nothing unusual about that. Fallen trees are common in old-growth forests. But this log was distinctive. It had been struck by lightning at some point, leaving a black, spiraling scar down its entire length. And carved into the bark, someone had scratched the initials JM plus KR inside a rough heart. I stepped over it and continued walking. 15 minutes later, I saw the same log again. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the lightning scar, at those same initials carved into the bark. JM plus KR. This wasn't possible. I had been walking in a straight line. My GPS confirmed it. But here was the same fallen tree, blocking the trail at the exact same angle. My hand started shaking as I pulled out my phone. No signal, as expected, but I opened my compass app anyway. According to the digital compass, I was facing northeast. the same direction I'd been traveling when I first encountered the log. I looked behind me. The trail stretched back through the trees, disappearing into the green shadows. I looked ahead. More of the same. I decided to backtrack. Maybe I had somehow gotten confused, taken a wrong turn without realizing it. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come, moving faster now, my hiking boots crunching on the carpet of fallen needles. But after 20 minutes of walking, I reached the log again. The same log, with the same lightning scar, the same carved initials. But now I was approaching it from the opposite direction. The panic hit me then, a cold wave that started in my chest and spread to my limbs. This wasn't possible. I was an experienced hiker. I understood navigation. I understood how trails worked. You couldn't walk in a straight line and end up where you started. The laws of physics don't work that way. Unless I wasn't walking in a straight line. Unless my GPS was wrong. Unless something else was happening here. I checked the time on my phone. 2:17 p.m. I'd been on the side trail for over 2 hours, when it should have taken 30 minutes at most. The sun was still filtering through the canopy, but it seemed lower than it should be, casting longer shadows between the trees. I made a decision. I would ignore the trail entirely and walk directly through the forest, using my compass to maintain a straight line toward where I knew the main Mirror Lake trail had to be. I stepped off the path and into the undergrowth, pushing through sword ferns and stepping over fallen branches. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but something else. Something that felt like held breath, like something waiting. My footsteps seemed muffled, as if the sound was being absorbed by the trees themselves. Even the normal forest sounds, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through branches, had stopped. After what felt like an hour of pushing through the forest, fighting through thick undergrowth and scrambling over fallen logs, I stumbled back onto a trail. Relief flooded through me until I looked down and saw the familiar, lightning-scarred log blocking my path. JM plus KR. The initials seemed to mock me. I was back where I started. But that was impossible. I had walked in a straight line, away from the trail. I had my compass. I had been careful to maintain my direction. The sun was getting lower. According to my phone, it was now 4:45 p.m. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, and I was no closer to getting out than when I'd started. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of boots on the trail behind me. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker, someone who could help me figure out what was going wrong. But the trail behind me was empty. I stood perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. I started walking again, moving faster now. Behind me, the footsteps resumed, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I ran, they ran. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. As I walked, I started noticing things on the trail that hadn't been there before. A water bottle, half buried under fallen leaves. A granola bar wrapper. A hiking boot, just one, sitting beside the path as if someone had stopped to empty a rock from it, and then left it behind. The strangest thing was how old some of these items looked. The water bottle was covered in moss. The granola bar wrapper was so faded I couldn't read the brand name. And the hiking boot. It was a style I hadn't seen in years, the kind of heavy leather boot people wore in the 80s and 90s. I picked up the water bottle and nearly dropped it when I saw what was scratched into the plastic. If you're reading this, you're trapped too. The trail doesn't end. It doesn't want us to leave. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the bottle. I looked around wildly, searching the forest for any sign of who might have left it. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there? Can you help me?" My voice echoed strangely among the trees, as if the sound was being bent and twisted by the forest itself. And in that echo, I heard something else. Voices. Multiple voices calling back to me. Help me. I can't find the way out. How long have I been here? Please, someone help me. The voices seemed to come from all directions, some close, some distant, all of them filled with the same desperate fear I was feeling. But when I ran toward the sounds, crashing through the undergrowth, I found nothing. Just more trees, more shadows, more silence. I made it back to the trail and started running. I didn't care about the footsteps behind me anymore. Didn't care about the impossible geography. I just ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. And every few minutes, I passed the log again. The same lightning-scarred tree, the same carved initials. JM plus KR, over and over and over, like a broken record, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The sun was setting now, painting the forest in shades of orange and red that looked like fire between the trees. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and completely lost despite being on what should have been a familiar trail. My phone battery was at 15%, and I'd given up checking my GPS. It kept showing me walking in a straight line, even as I passed the same landmarks repeatedly. That's when night fell, and everything changed. In the darkness, my flashlight beam revealed things that hadn't been there in the daylight. Shapes moving between the trees, just at the edge of the light. Eyes reflecting the beam, but too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. And the footsteps behind me multiplied, became a chorus of boots and bare feet, and things that didn't quite sound like either. I was approaching the log again. I'd lost count of how many times I'd passed it, when my flashlight illuminated something that made me scream. People. Standing in the trees around the trail, just at the edge of the light. Maybe a dozen of them, men and women of different ages, all wearing hiking gear from different eras. They stood perfectly still, watching me, their faces blank and their eyes reflecting my flashlight like mirrors. One of them stepped forward, a middle-aged man in an REI fleece jacket and hiking boots. His hair was gray, his face weathered, but his expression was completely empty. "You can't leave," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "None of us can leave. The trail won't let us." "How long have you been here?" I whispered. "I don't remember," he replied. "Time doesn't work the same way here. Could be days, could be years." I started forgetting things after a while. My name, my family, my life before the trail. Behind him, the other figures nodded in unison, their movements synchronized like a chorus line. "But you remember the trail," I said. "The trail is all there is," a woman spoke up. She was wearing clothes from the 70s, bell-bottom jeans and a wool sweater. We walk, and we walk, and we walk, past the log, around the trees, back to the log, forever. "There has to be a way out," I said, backing away from them. "There's always a way out." "Is there?" the man asked, tilting his head. "You've been walking for hours. How many times have you passed the log? How many times have you tried to leave the trail? How many times have you failed?" I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear them following, but their footsteps were different now. Not the sound of boots on packed earth, but something softer, more dispersed, like they were floating just above the ground. I crashed through the forest, abandoning the trail entirely, pushing through undergrowth so thick it tore at my clothes and skin. Branches whipped across my face, roots caught my feet, but I kept running. I had to get away from the trail, away from those people, away from whatever force was keeping us trapped in this impossible loop. For hours I stumbled through the darkness, using my failing flashlight to navigate between the massive trees. My water was gone, my phone was dead, and I was running on pure adrenaline and terror. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, I saw it. A sign nailed to a tree. Mirror Lake Trail. 0.5 miles. I'd never been so happy to see anything in my life. I stumbled onto the main trail, my legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. Other hikers were already out for early morning walks, and they looked at me with concern. A disheveled woman emerging from the deep forest, covered in scratches and mud, babbling about impossible trails and people who couldn't leave. The park rangers found me sitting on a bench at the trailhead, trying to process what had happened. I told them I'd gotten lost, that I'd spent the night in the forest. I didn't mention the loop or the voices or the people standing in the trees. They would have thought I was suffering from exposure and hallucinations. Maybe I was. But when I got home, I started researching. Missing hikers in Mount Hood National Forest. People who had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. And I found them. James Morrison, missing since 1987. Catherine Reed, disappeared 1993. JM and KR, the initials carved into the log. There were others, dozens of others over the years, all experienced hikers who knew the area well. All last seen on or near the Mirror Lake Trail. I tried to report what I'd experienced, but who would believe me? A trail that loops back on itself? People trapped in the forest for decades? It sounds like the ravings of someone who spent too long alone in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know that unmarked side trail is still there, still waiting for the next hiker who thinks they know a shortcut. The trail has been officially closed now. The Forest Service cited unsafe conditions and ongoing geological instability. But I know the real reason. I think someone else has experienced what I experienced, and they're trying to keep people away. If you're listening to this, and you're a hiker, please remember this story. Not all trails lead where they're supposed to go. Not all paths have an ending. And if you ever find yourself walking past the same landmark over and over again, if you ever hear footsteps behind you that stop when you stop, if you ever see people standing in the trees watching you with empty eyes, run. Get off the trail. Go through the forest if you have to. And don't stop running until you see that sign that tells you you've made it back to the real world. Because some trails don't want you to leave. Some trails want to keep you walking forever, past the same log, around the same trees, with the same empty people for company. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I'm back on that trail. And in my dreams, I can hear them calling to me from the forest. Come back, Sarah. The trail misses you. We're all still here, waiting. Come back, and walk with us forever. If you're still listening to this, you probably enjoy stories that get under your skin like this one does. A like or comment really helps keep these encounters alive for others who need to hear them. Because sometimes, someone needs to know they're not alone in what they've experienced. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, during my senior year at Michigan State. 4 of us went into the woods that weekend. Only 1 came back. The official report says it was a hiking accident, that my friends fell into a ravine during a storm. But that's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened. My name is Jake Morrison, and I need you to understand something before I start. We weren't idiots. We weren't the kind of college kids who go into the wilderness unprepared, looking for a party spot, or trying to prove how tough we are. Marcus, Ashley, Tom, and I, we'd been exploring abandoned places together for 2 years. Old factories, defunct hospitals, ghost towns. We knew how to research locations, how to stay safe, how to get out if things went wrong. We thought we knew, anyway. It was late October, and we'd planned a weekend camping trip in the Hiawatha National Forest, up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The original plan was simple. Hike in Friday afternoon, set up camp near one of the designated sites, spend Saturday exploring some of the old logging camps we'd found, marked on historical maps from the 1920s. But plans change when you find something unexpected. We'd hiked about 5 miles into the forest, following an old logging road that had been overgrown for decades. The trees up there are different from what you see in the lower part of the state. Massive white pines and hemlocks that block out so much sunlight, it feels like perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. The silence is complete. No traffic, no planes overhead, no human sounds at all. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional crack of a tree settling. Marcus spotted it first. He was always the one with the best eye for hidden details. Probably why he was such a good photography major. "Hey," he called out, pointing off to our left. "Is that a structure?" We stopped and looked where he was pointing. About 100 yards off the old road, barely visible through the trees, was what looked like a roof. Dark wooden shingles, moss-covered, but definitely man-made. "That's not on any of our maps," Ashley said, pulling out the topographical survey we'd been using to navigate. She was our planner, the one who researched everything down to the smallest detail before we went anywhere. There shouldn't be any buildings in this area. Tom was already heading toward it, his curiosity overriding his usual caution. "Come on, let's check it out. Probably just an old hunting cabin." We followed him through the undergrowth, pushing past low-hanging branches and stepping over fallen logs. As we got closer, the structure resolved into a small log cabin, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. It was old. You could tell by the way the logs had weathered to a silvery gray, and how the chinking between them had crumbled away in places. But it wasn't abandoned, not completely. The windows were intact, covered from the inside with what looked like heavy curtains. The door was solid, made of thick planks, held together with iron hinges that showed no signs of rust. And most telling of all, there was a faint but unmistakable smell of wood smoke in the air. "Someone's been here recently," I said, stating the obvious. Ashley was studying the cabin with a frown. "This doesn't make sense. We're miles from any road, in the middle of a national forest. You can't just build a cabin here without permits, without access routes." "Maybe it's grandfathered in," Marcus suggested, already taking photos. "Built before the area became protected." But even as he said it, something felt wrong. The cabin looked old, yes, but it also looked maintained. Not like a historical structure that had been sitting empty for decades, but like someone had been taking care of it, keeping it functional. Tom was examining the windows more closely. "Guys, look at this." We gathered around where he was standing. The window was dirty, but we could see inside through a gap in the curtains. What we saw made no sense. The interior of the cabin was lit by candles, dozens of them, arranged around the room in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The furniture was sparse. A table, a few chairs, some shelves along the walls. But the walls themselves. The walls were covered in drawings, charcoal sketches, pencil drawings, some that looked like they'd been scratched directly into the wood with fingernails. And they were all the same subject, repeated over and over, with obsessive precision. Trees, but not normal trees. These trees had faces in the bark, human faces twisted in expressions of agony or terror. The branches weren't branches but arms, reaching out desperately. The roots weren't roots, but fingers, clawing at the earth. "What the hell?" Ashley whispered. Marcus was already moving to the next window, trying to get a better view. "There's more stuff in here. Books, papers. And look at this." He'd found a window that offered a view of the far wall. Mounted there, like hunting trophies, were what looked like pieces of bark. But as we stared, we realized they weren't bark at all. They were wood carvings, incredibly detailed, showing the same twisted faces we'd seen in the drawings. "We should go," I said. Everything about this place felt wrong, felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. "This is obviously someone's property. someone who might not appreciate visitors. But Tom was already trying the door. "It's locked," he said, then immediately started examining the lock more closely. "But it's just a basic deadbolt. I could get us in." "Absolutely not," I said. "We're not breaking into someone's cabin." "Come on, Jake," Marcus said, still taking photos. "When are we going to get another chance like this?" This place is incredible. Look at those carvings, those drawings. This is someone's art studio, out here in the middle of nowhere. Or it's someone's psychotic break, Ashley pointed out. Those drawings don't look like art to me. They look like obsession. But even as she said it, I could see the curiosity in her eyes. We'd all been drawn to abandoned places for the same reason. The mystery, the stories hidden in forgotten spaces. And this place was definitely hiding stories. Tom had his lockpicks out. He'd learned the skill from YouTube videos, claimed it was for urban exploration purposes only. In 30 seconds, the deadbolt clicked open. "Tom, don't," I started to say. But he was already pushing the door open. The smell hit us immediately. Not just wood smoke, but something else. Something organic and sweet and rotten, like fruit that had been left to decay. We all hesitated on the threshold, but curiosity won out over caution. The interior was exactly as we'd seen through the windows, but being inside made everything feel more intense, more personal. The candles cast flickering shadows that made the drawn faces on the walls seem to move, seem to watch us as we entered. Ashley went straight to the bookshelves. "These are journals," she said, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. Handwritten, dated. This one's from 1987. Marcus was photographing everything, his flash adding harsh white light to the warm glow of the candles. "This is incredible. Someone's been documenting something out here for decades." Tom had found a wooden chest in the corner and was examining its contents. "Guys, you need to see this." We gathered around as he lifted out what looked like a piece of wood, carved into the shape of a human figure. But the details were wrong, disturbing. The figure's arms were too long, its fingers extended into root-like tendrils. Its face was stretched, mouth open in a silent scream. "There are dozens of them," Tom said, pulling out more carvings. Each one was unique, but followed the same theme. Human forms twisted and transformed, merged with tree elements, frozen in expressions of terror or ecstasy. Ashley was reading from the journal, her voice growing quieter as she continued. "Listen to this. Day 847. The communion was successful again last night. They spoke to me through the bark, through the roots. They showed me how the boundary works, how thin it is here. Soon, I'll be ready for the final transformation." "Final transformation?" Marcus asked, still photographing. Ashley flipped through more pages. "There's a lot here about rituals, about something called the deep forest consciousness. And look at this date. This entry is from last month." We all stopped what we were doing. Last month meant whoever lived here was still active, still using the cabin. "We need to leave," I said again. "Right now." But that's when we heard it. A sound from outside, like footsteps on the wooden porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. We all froze, listening. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. Then came the voice. Deep, gravelly, speaking words in a language none of us recognized. But even though we couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear. It was angry. It was threatening. And it knew we were inside. The door handle began to turn. Tom grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace. Marcus put himself between Ashley and the door. I looked around desperately for another exit, but the cabin had only one door, and the windows were too small to climb through quickly. The door swung open, but nobody came in. The doorway was empty, showing only the dark forest beyond. The footsteps had stopped, The voice had gone silent. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice cracking slightly. "We're sorry for intruding. We'll leave right now." No response. Marcus moved toward the door, camera still in hand. "I don't see anyone out there." That's when Ashley screamed. She was still holding the journal, but now she was staring at one of the carvings on the wall. "It moved," she whispered. "I swear to God, it moved. The face, it turned to look at me." We all looked at the carving she was pointing to. It was one of the tree-human hybrids, a figure with bark-like skin and branch arms. Its face was turned toward us, wooden eyes seeming to track our movements. "Wood doesn't move, Ash," Marcus said, but his voice was uncertain. "Then explain this," she said, opening the journal to a page near the back. "This entry is dated today. Today, Jake? And look what it says." She read aloud. "4 visitors came today. Young ones, full of curiosity and life. They will make excellent additions to the grove. The trees are hungry for new growth." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 20 degrees. All the candle flames flickered at once, casting wild shadows on the walls. "We're leaving." "Now," I said, heading for the door. But as I reached the threshold, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down and nearly screamed. What looked like a root had emerged from between the floorboards, wrapping around my leg with impossible strength. As I watched in horror, more roots began pushing up through the wooden floor, reaching for all of us. Tom swung the poker at the root holding me, and it released with a sound like breaking branches. "Run!" he shouted. We burst out of the cabin and into the forest, not bothering with the path, just crashing through the undergrowth as fast as we could move. Behind us, I could hear sounds that made no sense. Wood creaking and groaning, like massive trees swaying in a storm. But there was no wind. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until our lungs were burning and our legs could barely carry us. When we finally stopped, we were deep in the forest, surrounded by the massive pines and hemlocks, with no idea which direction the cabin was or which direction led back to our intended campsite. "What the hell was that?" Ashley gasped, leaning against a tree. "Mass hallucination," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Carbon monoxide from the candles, maybe. Or some kind of drug in the air." But Tom was staring at his ankle, where the root had grabbed him. His pant leg was torn, and underneath, his skin showed perfect impressions of bark texture. We set up camp right there, not wanting to risk getting more lost by trying to navigate in the dark. None of us slept much. Every sound from the forest, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Ashley kept reading from the journal she'd grabbed during our escape. Most of it was illegible, written in shaky handwriting that got progressively worse as the entries went on. But some passages were clear enough to understand, and they painted a picture of someone who had come to the forest for solitude and had found something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the deep woods for a very long time. The entries described rituals performed at the base of certain trees, offerings left in hollow stumps, voices that spoke through the rustling of leaves. And gradually, the writer had begun to change. The handwriting shifted, became more angular, less human. The language grew strange, incorporating words that didn't appear in any dictionary. The final entries were barely readable, but one phrase appeared over and over. "Feed the grove. Feed the grove. Feed the grove." As dawn broke, we packed up our campsite and started trying to find our way back to the logging road. But the forest seemed different in daylight. The trees were arranged wrong, the spaces between them too narrow, the canopy too thick. It was like trying to navigate through a maze that kept changing its layout. And we kept hearing sounds, footsteps that matched our pace, voices calling our names from directions where no one should be, branches breaking overhead, as if something large was moving through the canopy. Tom was the first to change. It started with him claiming he could hear the trees talking, that they were giving him directions. At first we thought it was just stress, just his way of coping with being lost. But as the day wore on, his behavior became more erratic. He would stop suddenly and press his ear against tree trunks, nodding as if he was having a conversation. His speech became stilted, formal, like he was translating from another language. By afternoon, he was leading us deeper into the forest, following paths that weren't really paths, heading in directions that felt wrong according to our compass. "Tom, we need to head south," I said. "The road has to be south of here." But he just smiled, and his smile was all wrong. "The trees know better than your compass, Jake. They've been here much longer than humans. They know the real paths." That's when Ashley pointed out that Tom's skin was changing. What we'd thought were dirt stains on his arms and face were actually patterns, dark lines that looked like bark texture spreading under his skin. Marcus tried to grab Tom, to force him to stop and listen to reason. But when he touched Tom's arm, his hand came away covered in something that looked like tree sap. Tom laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "It feels like coming home." We tried to keep following him, hoping he would lead us out. But as the sun set, Tom began to slow down. His movements became jerky, unnatural. And then he stopped walking entirely. He just stood there, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, his arms raised toward the canopy. The bark patterns on his skin had spread, covering most of his exposed flesh. His clothes were falling away, revealing skin that was more wood than human. "The transformation is beautiful," he said, but his voice was different now. Deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from multiple throats. "You should join me. We could be part of the grove forever." Ashley was crying, backing away from him. "Tom, please, fight this. Come back with us." But Tom was already changing further. His feet had pushed roots into the ground, anchoring him in place. His arms were extending, becoming branches, sprouting leaves despite the late season. "Tom is gone," the thing that had been our friend said. Tom chose to feed the grove. Tom chose transformation over death. We ran then, leaving our friend behind, as he completed his metamorphosis into something that was no longer human. We ran through the dark forest, guided only by our failing flashlight and the desperate hope that we would find our way out. Marcus was next. He started talking to himself, having conversations with people who weren't there. But when we listened closely, we realized he was responding to voices we couldn't hear, voices that seemed to be coming from the trees around us. "They're offering us a choice," he explained when we asked him what was happening. "Stay and become part of the forest consciousness, or try to leave and die in the woods. Lost, starving, afraid." "There's a third option," I said. "We find our way out and never come back." But Marcus was already showing the same bark patterns on his skin that Tom had developed. "The third option is an illusion, Jake. No one leaves the deep forest once they've been chosen. The grove is hungry, and we're the food it's been waiting for." He disappeared during the night. We woke up to find his sleeping bag empty. No signs of a struggle. Just gone, as if he'd walked away while we slept. Ashley and I were alone. We kept moving, kept trying to find a way out. But the forest had become a labyrinth. Every direction looked the same. Every path led deeper into the woods. Our food was running low. Our water was almost gone, and we could both feel something changing in our own bodies. I was starting to hear the voices Marcus had described, whispers in the wind, conversations in languages I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They were seductive, those voices. They promised an end to hunger, an end to fear, an end to the loneliness of being merely human. Ashley was fighting it harder than I was. She kept reading from the journal, trying to find some clue about how to escape. But even as she read, I could see the bark pattern starting to appear on her neck, spreading upward toward her face. "There has to be a way out," she kept saying. "There has to be something we're missing." But I was beginning to understand that there wasn't. The forest didn't want us to leave. We'd stumbled into something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting patiently for new victims to wander into its territory. The voices were getting stronger, more insistent. They were showing me visions of what I could become, part of a vast network of consciousness that spanned the entire forest, connected through root systems and fungal networks, aware of every bird, every insect, every drop of rain that fell within its boundaries. It was beautiful in a way, seductive, an end to all the petty human concerns that had driven me to seek out abandoned places in the first place. Ashley disappeared on the fourth night. I woke up to find her sleeping bag empty, just like Marcus's had been. But this time, I heard her voice calling to me from deeper in the forest. "Jake," she called, her voice echoing strangely among the trees. "Jake, I found the way out. Follow my voice." I knew it was a trap. I knew the forest was using her voice to lure me deeper, to complete whatever process had claimed my friends. But I followed anyway. Not because I believed she'd found an escape, but because I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in that place. I found her in another clearing, surrounded by trees that looked older than the rest of the forest. Ancient giants with trunks so massive they seemed like living towers. Ashley was standing in the center of the clearing, but she wasn't alone. Tom was there, or what had been Tom. He'd completed his transformation, his body now a young tree with bark-covered skin and branch arms that swayed without any wind. Marcus stood beside him, his metamorphosis nearly complete, his face already more wood than flesh. And Ashley was changing too. The bark patterns had spread across her entire body, and her feet were putting down roots, anchoring her to the earth. "Join us, Jake," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Stop fighting it. Stop running. The transformation isn't death, it's transcendence." I could feel the pull then, stronger than ever. The voices in my head were no longer whispers, but a chorus, promising peace, promising belonging, promising an end to the isolation and confusion of human existence. For a moment, I almost gave in. The idea of becoming part of something larger, something eternal, was incredibly appealing. No more worries about jobs or relationships or the future. Just existence as part of the forest consciousness, aware and alive for centuries to come. But something in Ashley's eyes stopped me. Even as her body transformed, even as her voice took on inhuman qualities, her eyes were still human, and they were terrified. She was still in there, somewhere, trapped inside the thing she was becoming. They all were. I ran. I crashed through the forest, no longer caring about direction or paths, or finding the way out. I just ran, driven by pure animal terror and the desperate need to escape whatever force was trying to claim me. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not just Ashley and Tom and Marcus, but others. Dozens of others. Maybe hundreds. All the people who had wandered into the deep forest over the years and never returned. All of them transformed. All of them part of the grove now. All of them trying to bring me back. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my lungs were burning and my legs collapsed beneath me. I fell beside a small stream, gasping for air, waiting for them to catch up and drag me back to join their forest collective. But they didn't come. I lay there for hours, listening for footsteps or voices, but the forest had gone silent. Even the normal sounds, birds, insects, wind through leaves, had stopped completely. When I finally stood up and looked around, I realized why they hadn't followed me. I was no longer in the deep forest. The massive old-growth trees were gone, replaced by younger pines and maples. The canopy was thinner, allowing actual sunlight to reach the ground. And in the distance, I could hear something I'd almost forgotten existed. The sound of cars on a highway. I'd somehow crossed back into the normal world. It took me 6 more hours to reach the road, and another 2 hours before a park ranger picked me up. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and barely coherent. I told them my friends and I had gotten separated during a hiking accident, that I'd been wandering for days trying to find them. They organized search parties. Helicopters scanned the forest from above. Teams of volunteers combed through the woods on the ground. They never found any trace of Tom, Marcus, or Ashley. No bodies, no personal belongings, no signs of what had happened to them. The official report concluded that they had fallen into a ravine during a sudden storm and been swept away by floodwaters. Their bodies were presumed lost, carried downstream by the current. I never told anyone the truth. Who would believe me? A story about a cabin that shouldn't exist, about people transforming into trees, about a forest consciousness that feeds on human visitors. They'd think I was suffering from exposure-induced hallucinations, or that I'd had some kind of psychotic break brought on by the trauma of losing my friends. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to them. And sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, there's no voice on the other end. Just the sound of wind through leaves, and underneath that, voices calling my name. Jake. Come back to us, Jake. The grove is waiting. The transformation is beautiful, Jake. Join us. I've changed my number 4 times. It doesn't matter. They always find me. The calls are getting more frequent lately. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city, I see trees that shouldn't be there. Ancient oaks and pines growing in places where they were never planted. Their bark marked with patterns that look almost like faces. I think they're trying to expand their territory. I think the deep forest consciousness is sending out scouts, trying to establish footholds in the human world. And I think they're still hoping I'll come back willingly. But I won't. I can't. Because I know that if I ever set foot in those woods again, if I ever answer their call, I'll join my friends in their eternal grove. I'll become another voice calling out to lost hikers, another predator disguised as salvation. The cabin is still out there, somewhere in the deep forest. The journals are still recording new entries, written by hands that are no longer entirely human. And the grove is still growing, still hungry, still waiting for the next group of curious explorers to wander off the marked trails. If you're planning to go hiking in remote areas, please be careful. Stay on marked trails. Travel in groups. And if you ever find a cabin that shouldn't exist, if you ever hear voices calling from the deep forest, if you ever see trees with faces in their bark, run. Don't look back, don't listen to the voices, and don't stop running until you reach the safety of the civilized world. Because some things in the wilderness are older and hungrier than we can imagine. And once they notice you, they never stop watching. I've been a volunteer firefighter and search and rescue coordinator for 12 years. In that time, I've helped find dozens of missing people, lost hikers, confused elderly folks, kids who wandered too far from camp. Most of the time, these stories have happy endings. Most of the time. But what happened during the Emma Walsh search 3 years ago? That's something I've never been able to talk about until now. Something I've never been able to forget. My name is David Reeves, and I live in Kalispell, Montana, about 30 miles from Glacier National Park. Search and rescue is volunteer work here. We get called out maybe once or twice a month during hiking season, usually for people who underestimated the terrain or got caught in sudden weather changes. It's rewarding work, bringing people home to their families. The call came in on a Saturday morning in late September. 8-year-old Emma Walsh had disappeared from her family's campsite sometime during the night. They were camping at one of the backcountry sites in the Nyack Wilderness, about 15 miles from the nearest road. Remote area, dense forest, easy place to get lost if you don't know where you're going. Emma's parents, Jim and Karen Walsh, had driven up from Missoula for a weekend camping trip. According to their statement, Emma had been sleeping in her own small tent, right next to theirs. They'd checked on her at bedtime around 9 p.m., and she'd been fast asleep. When Karen went to wake her up for breakfast at 7 a.m., the tent was empty. No signs of a struggle. No torn tent fabric or scattered belongings. Emma's sleeping bag was still zipped up, as if she'd somehow slipped out without disturbing it. Her shoes were still in the tent, which meant she'd gone barefoot into the wilderness. The parents' story bothered me from the start. I've got 2 kids of my own, and I know how light sleepers' children can be, especially in unfamiliar places. For an 8-year-old to get out of her sleeping bag, unzip her tent, and wander into the forest without making enough noise to wake her parents, it didn't add up. But people react to stress in different ways, and sometimes details get confused in the panic of discovering a missing child. My job wasn't to investigate the family. It was to find Emma and bring her home safely. The search team assembled at the trailhead by noon. 6 volunteers, including myself, all experienced in wilderness rescue. We had topographical maps, GPS units, radios, emergency medical supplies, and enough gear to stay in the field for several days if necessary. The weather was clear but cold, with overnight temperatures expected to drop into the 30s. A barefoot 8-year-old wouldn't survive long in those conditions. We hiked in quickly, reaching the Walsh campsite by 2 p.m. The site was exactly as the parents had described. 2 tents set up in a small clearing, camping gear neatly organized, no signs of disturbance. But as I examined the area more closely, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with worry. There were no tracks. The ground around the campsite was soft dirt and fallen leaves, perfect for showing footprints. I could see where the parents had walked, where they'd set up their tents, where they'd collected firewood. But there were no small footprints leading away from Emma's tent. No sign that she'd walked out of the campsite in any direction. Could she have stayed on the trail? Asked Jenny Martinez, one of our newer volunteers. She was young, eager, still believed every search would end with a successful rescue. I studied the packed earth of the main trail, a few boot prints from other hikers, but nothing that looked like bare feet. I don't think so, I said. And even if she did, where would she go? The trail leads back toward the trailhead in one direction, deeper into the wilderness in the other. An 8-year-old wouldn't choose either option. We divided into 3 pairs and began our search pattern. Standard procedure: start close to the last known location and work outward in expanding circles. Each team took a different direction, maintaining radio contact, calling Emma's name every few minutes. Jenny and I headed north, into the thickest part of the forest. The trees in that area are massive, old-growth cedars and hemlocks that create their own twilight, even in the middle of the day. Visibility drops to maybe 30 feet in any direction, and sound gets muffled by the thick canopy overhead. We'd been searching for about an hour when we heard it. "Help me." The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably a child's voice, a girl's voice. "Emma!" Jenny called out. "Emma, is that you? Keep talking, honey. We're coming to find you. Help me. I'm scared." The voice seemed to be coming from our left, deeper into the forest. We adjusted our direction and started moving toward the sound, calling out encouragement, telling Emma to keep talking so we could find her. But as we walked, something felt wrong. The voice never seemed to get any closer, despite us moving toward it. And it never changed. The same words, the same tone, like a recording being played on repeat. "Help me! I'm scared! Help me! I'm scared!" "Emma, can you tell us where you are?" I called out. "Can you see anything around you? Trees? Rocks? Water?" But the voice just continued with the same phrase, never responding to our questions, never providing any new information. We followed the sound for over an hour, crashing through undergrowth, climbing over fallen logs, always moving toward the voice, but never getting any closer to it. Jenny was getting frustrated, and I was getting worried. In wilderness rescue, you learn to trust your instincts, and my instincts were telling me something was very wrong about this situation. That's when our radios crackled to life. "David, this is Mike. We're hearing a child's voice over here too. About half a mile south of your position." I stopped, walking, and keyed my radio. "Say again, Mike." "We've got a kid calling for help. Female voice, sounds young. We're tracking toward it now." Jenny and I looked at each other. If Mike's team was hearing a child's voice half a mile south of us, and we were hearing the same thing, that meant either there were two missing children, or something else was going on. "All teams, radio check," I said. "Report your positions and status." "Team 2 here," came Pete's voice. "We're about a quarter-mile east of the campsite. We've been following a child's voice for the past 30 minutes. "Team 3, reported Sarah. "West of the campsite, maybe 300 yards. We've got audio contact with what sounds like the missing girl." 4 different teams, in 4 different locations, all following the voice of the same missing child. All hearing the same words, the same tone, the same endless repetition of, "Help me. I'm scared." "All teams converge on the campsite," I ordered. "Something's not right here." But when we tried to head back, we discovered another problem. None of us could find the campsite. I've been navigating wilderness areas for over a decade. I know how to use a compass, how to read terrain, how to backtrack along the route I've traveled. But when we tried to return to the Walsh campsite, it simply wasn't there. We should have been able to see the clearing through the trees. We should have been able to see the bright orange tents the family had been using. But in every direction, all we could see were more trees, more shadows, more of the same unchanging forest. "David, we've got a problem," Mike's voice came through the radio, tinged with concern. "We can't find our way back to base camp. GPS is showing our location, but the terrain doesn't match what we're seeing." I checked my own GPS unit. According to the device, we were exactly where we should be, standing right in the middle of the Walsh campsite. But visually, we were surrounded by dense forest, with no sign of any human presence. "All teams, sound off," I said. "Everyone confirm your GPS readings." One by one, the other teams reported the same thing. Their GPS units showed them at or near the campsite, but none of them could actually see it. "Equipment malfunction?" Jenny suggested, but her voice was uncertain. I'd seen GPS units fail before, but never all at once, never in perfect weather conditions. And the child's voice was still calling from the forest around us, still repeating the same plea for help. "Help me. I'm scared. Help me. I'm scared." But now that we were all listening more carefully, we noticed something that chilled us to the bone. The voice wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was coming from everywhere. North, south, east, west, even from above us in the canopy. The same voice, speaking the same words, but from multiple locations simultaneously. "This isn't right," Jenny whispered. "This isn't possible." I was starting to agree with her. In 12 years of search and rescue, I'd never encountered anything like this. Lost hikers don't duplicate themselves. Voices don't come from multiple directions at once. "All teams, new plan," I said into the radio. "We stick together. everyone converge on my position. But as the other teams tried to reach us, following our radio signals, they reported the same problem we'd been having. They could hear us clearly. They were walking toward our voices, but they never seemed to get any closer. It was like the forest had somehow expanded, creating impossible distances between points that should have been only a few hundred yards apart. That's when we started finding the evidence. Jenny spotted it first. A piece of orange fabric caught on a branch about 8 feet off the ground. The same bright orange as the Walsh family's tents. "How did that get up there?" she asked. I used my hiking poles to pull the fabric down. It was definitely from a camping tent, torn roughly as if it had been ripped away by force. But the interesting thing was how old it looked. The edges were faded. The material was brittle, as if it had been hanging in that tree for months rather than hours. "David," Mike's voice came through the radio. "We found something over here. Camping gear, scattered around like someone left in a hurry." "What kind of gear?" I asked. "Backpack, sleeping bag, hiking boots." "But David, this stuff looks old. Really old. The backpack has a logo I haven't seen since the 90s. Over the next hour, as we searched the area around our respective positions, each team found similar evidence. Pieces of camping equipment, fragments of clothing, personal items scattered through the forest. All of it old, faded, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. And all of it suggesting that there had been many more missing people in this area than official records indicated. I started thinking about other search and rescue calls we'd received over the years. Cases where people had simply vanished without a trace, where search teams had found no evidence of what had happened to them. How many of those missing persons had last been seen in this same area? "David, we need to get out of here." Sarah's voice came through the radio. She was one of our most experienced volunteers, not prone to panic. "I don't know what's happening, but this isn't a normal search and rescue situation." I was inclined to agree with her. Whatever was going on in these woods, it wasn't something we were equipped to handle. We needed to retreat, regroup, and come back with more resources. Maybe even contact the FBI if we were dealing with some kind of criminal activity. But as we tried to leave the search area, we discovered that we couldn't. No matter which direction we walked, no matter how carefully we followed our compasses, we always ended up back where we started. The forest had become a maze with no exit, trapping us in the same area where Emma Walsh had disappeared. And the child's voice kept calling to us. "Help me. I'm scared. Help me. I'm scared." But now we could hear other voices too. Adult voices, calling out names we didn't recognize. "Maria, where are you? Tommy, come back to camp. Please, someone help us find our daughter." Voices of other search parties, other worried parents, all echoing through the forest like ghosts of previous tragedies. Jenny was starting to panic. "David, what if we never get out? What if we end up like Emma, like all the others?" I tried to stay calm, to think rationally about our situation. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. Something in these woods was deliberately trapping people, luring them deeper with the voices of previous victims. "All teams, listen carefully," I said into the radio. "Stop following the voices. I repeat, do not follow any voices you hear. They're not coming from real people." "What do you mean?" Pete asked. "I think we're being lured into a trap. I think Emma Walsh disappeared months ago, maybe longer. And I think whatever happened to her is trying to happen to us." The silence on the radio stretched for several seconds before Mike's voice came through. "David, I hate to say this, but I think you're right. We just found a search and rescue vest with a name tag. Says Walsh E. But the vest looks like it's been here for years. Emma's vest. Evidence that she'd been in these woods much longer than her parents had claimed. Evidence that their story about her disappearing during the night was a lie. But why would parents lie about when their child had disappeared? What could they possibly gain by misleading the search teams, unless they weren't her parents at all? The realization hit me like a physical blow. The people who'd reported Emma missing, who'd provided the detailed story about the camping trip and the empty tent. What if they weren't Jim and Karen Walsh? What if they were something else? Something that had been using Emma's disappearance to lure search and rescue teams into the forest? I keyed my radio. All teams, we're dealing with something that's not human. The people who reported Emma missing, they were bait. They were trying to get us out here. David, you're scaring me, Jenny said. Good. You should be scared, because I think we're being hunted. As if in response to my words, the voices in the forest changed. They became more insistent, more urgent. But underneath the familiar pleas for help, we could hear something else. Something that sounded like laughter. Cold, cruel laughter that seemed to come from the trees themselves. And then, just as the sun was setting and the forest was falling into complete darkness, we saw them. Figures moving between the trees. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Their movements too fluid, too coordinated. They stayed just at the edge of our vision, never quite clear enough to make out details, but definitely there. Watching us. Surrounding us. Help me, one of them called out. But now we could see that the voice was coming from something that wasn't a child. I'm scared. It continued in Emma's voice, but the figure speaking was tall, adult-sized, with arms that hung too long at its sides. More figures appeared, all of them calling out in voices that didn't match their shapes. Adult voices from child-sized silhouettes, elderly voices from young figures, male voices from obviously female forms. They were using the voices of everyone who had ever disappeared in these woods, every missing person case that had brought search teams into their territory. Run, I whispered to Jenny. When I say go, run toward the creek we passed earlier. Follow the water downstream, no matter what you hear behind you. What about the others? I looked around at the figures closing in on us, at the impossible situation we'd stumbled into. I don't think there's anything we can do for the others now. The figures were getting closer, their borrowed voices becoming a chorus of desperate pleas and false promises. And underneath it all, that cold laughter, growing louder and more triumphant. Go, I shouted. Jenny and I ran toward the sound of running water, crashing through the undergrowth, while the voices behind us rose to a crescendo. I could hear the other teams on my radio, their voices panicked and confused, but I couldn't stop to help them. I couldn't even stop to explain. We ran through the darkness, guided only by the sound of the creek and the desperate hope that flowing water might lead us out of whatever supernatural trap we'd wandered into. Behind us, the voices of our teammates joined the chorus of the missing. Pete's voice, Sarah's voice, Mike's voice, all calling out the same desperate pleas that had lured us into the forest in the first place. Jenny and I followed the creek for what felt like hours, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs, soaking our boots in the icy water. But gradually, the voices behind us faded, and the oppressive feeling of being watched began to lift. When dawn broke, we found ourselves at a Forest Service road, miles from where we'd started the search. A passing park ranger picked us up and drove us back to the command post that had been set up for the search operation. The official report stated that 4 members of the search team had become disoriented in difficult terrain and were presumed to have fallen into a ravine. Their bodies were never recovered. The Emma Walsh case was closed, her disappearance attributed to a tragic accident during a family camping trip. But I know the truth. I know that there's something in those woods that feeds on human curiosity and compassion, something that uses our desire to help others as a weapon against us. I quit search and rescue after that night. I couldn't risk going back into those woods, couldn't risk encountering whatever force had claimed my teammates. But I still hear them sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right. Pete's voice, calling my name from the darkness outside my bedroom window. Sarah's voice, pleading for help from the trees in my backyard. Mike's voice, promising that if I just come back to the forest, everything will be explained. And sometimes I hear Emma's voice too. The real Emma, not the borrowed voice we'd been following. She sounds older now, like she's been aging during her time in whatever place those things took her. "Mr. Reeves," she says, "please don't forget about me. Please don't stop looking. I'm still here. I'm still waiting for someone to find me. But I can't go back. I won't go back, because I know that if I do, I'll join the voices calling out to the next search party, the next group of well-meaning volunteers who think they're going to save someone. If you're ever asked to join a search and rescue operation, if you're ever tempted to help look for missing people in remote wilderness areas, please be careful. Make sure the people asking for help are really who they claim to be. Make sure the missing person actually exists. Because some searches are just traps, and some voices calling for help are already beyond saving." 22 years. That's how long I worked as a park ranger before I finally requested a transfer to day shifts. 22 years of night patrols, of walking alone through forests that most people never see in darkness. I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. Bears, mountain lions, illegal campers, drug operations, the occasional lost hiker. I was wrong. My name is Robert Martinez, but everyone called me Bobby. I worked the night shift at Sequoia National Park in California, patrolling the remote areas where the giant sequoias grow. These trees are ancient, some of them over 3,000 years old, standing 250 feet tall, so massive that tunnels have been carved through their trunks for cars to drive through. At night, walking among these giants, you feel small in a way that's hard to describe. The trees tower above you like living skyscrapers, their trunks disappearing into darkness, so complete that your flashlight beam can't reach the canopy. The forest floor is carpeted with centuries of fallen needles, creating a silence so profound that your own heartbeat sounds loud in comparison. I loved the night shift initially. The solitude, the peace, the sense of being a guardian watching over something truly sacred. Days brought crowds of tourists, buses full of school children, the chaos of human activity. But nights belonged to the forest. The first sign that something was wrong came in late October, 3 years ago. I was doing my usual patrol route, checking the backcountry camping areas, when I started getting reports from day shift rangers about campers who'd had unusual experiences during the night. A couple from Ohio said something large was moving through the trees around their campsite. Tom Wheeler, the day supervisor, told me during our shift change. They described it as bigger than a bear, moving through the canopy about 40 feet off the ground. "Probably just branches falling," I said. Old trees shed dead wood all the time, especially in the fall. But Tom shook his head. They said it was moving with purpose, like something was deliberately traveling from tree to tree. And they found tracks in the morning, impressions in the dirt around their tent that didn't match any animal they'd ever seen. I made a note to check the area during my patrol, but I wasn't particularly concerned. People camping in unfamiliar environments often misinterpret natural sounds and shadows. The human imagination is very good at turning ordinary wilderness activity into something mysterious and threatening. That night, I hiked out to the area where the Ohio couple had been camping. It was a designated backcountry site, about 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by some of the largest sequoias in the park. The trees in that area are truly massive, trunks 30 feet in diameter, their crowns lost in darkness high above. I found the tracks the campers had described. They were pressed deep into the soft earth around, where their tent had been pitched, and they definitely didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They were roughly human-shaped, but much larger, maybe 18 inches long, with what looked like elongated toes ending in claw marks. The stride length suggested something with legs much longer than a human's. But the strangest thing was how they appeared around the campsite. They didn't lead to or from anywhere. They just encircled the tent site in a perfect ring, as if something had stood in the surrounding forest and watched the campers sleep. I took photos and measurements, planning to send them to the wildlife biologists who consulted with the Park Service. But as I was working, I became aware of a feeling I'd never experienced in 22 years of wilderness work. I felt watched. It's a primitive sensation, something our ancestors developed to survive in environments full of predators. The hair on the back of your neck stands up. Your peripheral vision becomes more acute. Every sound seems amplified. I'd felt it occasionally when encountering mountain lions or aggressive bears. But this was different. This felt like intelligent observation. Like something was studying me with the same scientific interest I was showing in the tracks. I finished my documentation quickly and moved on with my patrol, but the feeling persisted. As I walked the trails between the giant trees, I could sense movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes shifting in the darkness between the trunks. Shadows that seemed to move independently of my flashlight beam. Several times I stopped and played my light around the forest, calling out standard warnings about unauthorized camping and park regulations. But my beam never caught anything more substantial than the massive trees themselves. The feeling of being watched continued for the rest of my shift, and by the time I headed back to the ranger station at dawn, I was exhausted from the constant state of alertness. Over the next few weeks, the reports from day shift rangers became more frequent and more specific. Campers described seeing something large moving through the treetops at night. Hikers found more of the strange tracks, always in perfect circles around their sleeping areas. Some people reported hearing sounds like whispering voices, speaking in languages they didn't recognize. And then the disappearances started. The first was a solo hiker named Michael Chen, an experienced outdoorsman from San Francisco, who'd been planning a 3-day backcountry trip. He'd filed all the proper permits, followed all the safety protocols, left detailed plans with family members about his intended route. He simply vanished. Search teams found his campsite intact, tent properly set up, food stored correctly in bear canisters, all his gear organized exactly as it should be. But Michael was gone, and there were no tracks leading away from the campsite. Just the same mysterious prints we'd been finding everywhere, circling, his tent in a perfect ring. The official explanation was that he'd left his campsite for some reason, maybe to relieve himself or investigate a sound, and had gotten disoriented in the darkness. Sequoia National Park covers over 400,000 acres of wilderness, much of it extremely difficult terrain. People could disappear in that landscape and never be found. But I knew something else was happening. The second disappearance occurred 2 weeks later. A couple from Portland, experienced hikers, who'd been visiting national parks for over a decade. Same pattern. Campsite intact. People gone. Mysterious tracks in a circle around where they'd been sleeping. By the time we lost the third camper, park management was getting concerned. 3 disappearances in 6 weeks was unprecedented in the park's history. They brought in additional search teams, installed motion-activated cameras in problem areas, and started requiring backcountry campers to check in every 12 hours via satellite communicator. None of it helped. The disappearances continued, and the survivors, people who'd had close encounters but managed to escape, began telling consistent stories. They described something massive moving through the trees at night, something that seemed to study human behavior with intense curiosity. Some reported seeing glimpses of a humanoid figure, but one that was far too large to be human, with limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly as it moved from tree to tree. And they all mentioned the eyes. Large, reflective eyes that watched from the darkness between the giant sequoias. Eyes that showed intelligence, purpose, and something that might have been hunger. As the only ranger working nights in the affected area, I was asked to file detailed reports about anything unusual I observed. But the truth was, I was seeing things I couldn't explain in any rational way. Shapes moving through the canopy high above, visible only as silhouettes against the stars. Sounds like massive branches creaking, but in patterns too regular to be natural, almost like a language made of wood and wind. And always, the feeling of being observed by something that was trying to understand what I was and why I was in its territory. The breaking point came on a November night when I was patrolling the area where most of the disappearances had occurred. I was checking one of the remote camping areas, playing my flashlight over the designated tent sites, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own voice, calling out from the forest beyond my light. "Hello? Park Ranger here. Is someone out there?" It was my voice, exactly, but I hadn't spoken. I was standing in complete silence, listening to something else use my words, my tone, my inflection to call out into the darkness. "Please respond if you can hear me. I'm here to help." Again, my voice, but coming from somewhere in the trees about 50 feet away. I played my flashlight toward the sound, but saw only the massive trunks of the sequoias, their bark patterns creating shadows that seemed to shift and move. Then I heard other voices. Voices I recognized from the radio, from years of working with the same team of rangers. Tom Wheeler's voice, Sarah Kim's voice, Mike Rodriguez's voice, all calling out standard Park Service phrases, all coming from different directions in the forest around me. But none of those people were on duty that night. They were all at home, asleep, while something in the forest borrowed their voices to communicate, or hunt, or whatever it was doing. I keyed my radio, hands shaking. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Martinez. I need immediate backup at Campsite 12. The response came through clearly. "Copy, Bobby. We're sending a team. ETA 20 minutes. But the voice on the radio was mine. I was hearing my own voice respond to my own call for help. That's when I saw it. Between two of the largest sequoias, perhaps 60 feet away, a shape that was too tall and too thin to be human, but moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. It was standing upright, but its arms seemed to stretch upward into the canopy, as if it was holding onto branches for support. Its legs were equally elongated, and its head? Its head was turned directly toward me, and its eyes reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel it studying me, trying to understand what kind of creature I was, just as I was trying to understand it. Then it spoke, not with its own voice, but with mine. The same words I just radioed to dispatch. "I need immediate backup at Campsite 12. But there was something wrong with the timing, something mechanical about the delivery, like it was playing back a recording rather than actually speaking. I took a step backward, keeping my flashlight trained on the creature. It didn't move, but I could see other shapes now, moving between the trees around me. More of them, all tall and thin and wrong, all watching me with those reflective eyes. My radio crackled to life again. "Bobby, this is dispatch. Are you okay out there? You sound distressed." But I hadn't said anything else. And the voice coming through the radio wasn't from dispatch. It was Sarah Kim's voice. Sarah, who was supposedly at home sleeping. "I'm fine," I said carefully into the radio. False alarm. Returning to normal patrol. The creature tilted its head, listening to my words. Then it repeated them, in my exact voice. I'm fine. False alarm. Returning to normal patrol. That's when I understood. These things weren't just watching human behavior. They were learning it. Recording our voices, our phrases, our patterns of communication. Maybe that's what had happened to the missing campers. Maybe they'd been taken not as food, but as sources of information about human behavior. I started backing away slowly, keeping my flashlight on the main creature while trying to track the others in my peripheral vision. They moved when I moved, maintaining their distance, but clearly following me. "Bobby, confirm your status," came another voice through the radio. This time it was my own voice, but I definitely hadn't spoken. I turned off my radio. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to give these things any more examples of human communication to study and mimic. The walk back to my patrol vehicle felt like the longest mile of my life. The creatures followed me the entire way, staying just at the edge of my flashlight beam, moving through the trees with an eerie grace that no human could match. They didn't make any threatening moves, but their presence felt malevolent, like predators evaluating prey. When I finally reached my truck, I was surprised to find that they didn't follow me onto the main road. They stopped at the edge of the forest, watching as I drove away, their reflective eyes visible in my rearview mirror until I rounded the first curve. I drove straight to the ranger station and called my supervisor at home. I told him everything: the voices, the creature, the sense that something ancient and intelligent was living in the sequoia groves and studying human visitors. To his credit, Jim listened to the entire story without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Bobby," he finally said, "you've been working nights for over 20 years. That's a lot of stress, a lot of isolation. Maybe it's time to consider a transfer to day shifts." "Jim, I know how this sounds, but take a week off," he interrupted. "Get some rest. Spend time with your family. We'll talk about reassignment when you come back." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that what I'd experienced was real. But I also knew how it sounded. A lone ranger, working nights in an isolated environment, reporting encounters with mysterious creatures that mimicked human voices. It sounded like the beginning of a psychological evaluation and early retirement. So I took the week off, but I also did some research. I spent hours in the library, digging through historical records and Native American tribal histories related to the Sequoia region. What I found made my encounters seem less like hallucinations and more like contact with something that had been living in those forests for centuries. The local Yokats tribes had stories about guardians of the giant trees, beings they called the Watchers of the Ancient Ones. According to tribal oral history, these guardians had existed since the first sequoias began growing, tasked with protecting the trees from any threat. They were described as tall, thin creatures that could move through the forest canopy like shadows, beings that learned the languages and behaviors of anyone who entered their territory. The stories said they were not inherently evil, but they were territorial and protective of the ancient groves. Most interesting was a passage I found in a 1920s anthropological study of Yokats folklore. "The Watchers do not harm those who respect the forest and leave no trace of their passing. But those who would damage the Ancient Ones, or who linger too long in the sacred groves, may find themselves taken to join the eternal guardianship of the trees." Taken to join the guardianship. Not killed, but recruited. I thought about the missing campers, about the perfect circles of tracks around their abandoned campsites. What if they hadn't been killed? What if they'd been converted somehow, transformed into guardians themselves? When I returned to work, I requested a transfer to day shifts. I told my supervisor I wanted to spend more time with my family. The 22 years of night work had been enough. It was approved without question. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd encountered in the sequoia groves. And I couldn't ignore the reports that continued to come in from my replacement on the night shift. More disappearances, more strange tracks, more reports of voices in the darkness and shapes moving through the canopy. My replacement lasted 6 weeks before requesting a transfer back to day shifts. His replacement lasted even less time. The Park Service eventually stopped assigning solo rangers to night patrols in the sequoia areas, citing staff safety concerns and budget constraints. But I knew the real reason. The Watchers were becoming more active, more bold in their interactions with humans. Maybe our presence was becoming too intrusive, too threatening to the ancient trees they protected. 6 months after my transfer, I was working a day shift when a hiker approached me near one of the largest sequoia groves. He was agitated, clearly upset about something he'd experienced during the night. "Ranger, I need to report something," he said. "I was camping back there last night, and I heard voices. Multiple people talking. But when I went to investigate, there was nobody there." "What kind of voices?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Park rangers," he said. They were using official terminology, talking about patrols and safety checks. But it was 3 in the morning, and when I called out, the voices stopped. And then I heard them again, coming from a different direction. Same voices, same words, but like they were being repeated by someone who didn't understand what they meant. I looked toward the sequoia grove, toward the massive trees that had stood in that spot for thousands of years. In the daylight, surrounded by tourists and families, they looked peaceful, majestic, completely harmless. But I knew better now. I knew that when darkness fell and the visitors went home, the ancient guardians emerged from their hiding places among the giant trees. They watched, they learned, they protected their territory using methods that humans couldn't understand. "Sir," I said to the hiker, "I'd recommend avoiding backcountry camping in this area. The terrain can be unstable, and it's easy to get disoriented in the darkness." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the truth I could safely tell. The hiker nodded and walked away, and I continued my patrol. But as I passed one of the largest sequoias, I noticed something carved into the bark about 8 feet off the ground. Fresh carvings, made recently with something sharp. Words in English, but arranged in a pattern that suggested someone who was still learning the language. Bobby Martinez, Night Ranger, respectful visitor. Safe passage granted. Below that, in the same careful lettering, others not so respectful. Others join guardianship. Others protect ancient ones forever. I stared at the carving for a long time, understanding its meaning. The Watchers had evaluated me during our encounter, had judged me to be respectful of their territory. I'd been granted safe passage because I hadn't tried to harm the trees or exploit the forest. But others hadn't been so lucky. I never reported the carving. Instead, I quietly began discouraging visitors from camping in the remote areas of the sequoia groves. I developed a reputation for being overly cautious about backcountry permits, for finding excuses to redirect hikers to more developed camping areas. Some of my colleagues thought I was being paranoid, but the disappearances stopped. Whatever bargain the Watchers had carved into that tree, it seemed to be working. I retired from the Park Service last year, but I still live near Sequoia National Park. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees, I can hear voices in the darkness. Familiar voices, speaking in the careful, measured tones of people who are still learning how to be human. They're the voices of the missing campers, I think. People who lingered too long in the sacred groves, who took too much from the ancient forest, who were judged unworthy of safe passage. Now they're guardians themselves, watching over trees that were old when their great-grandparents were born. Protecting something sacred from the endless stream of human visitors who don't understand what they're walking through. If you ever visit the giant sequoias, remember this story. Be respectful. Take only pictures. Leave only footprints. Don't linger too long in the deep groves after dark, because the watchers are still there, still evaluating every visitor, still deciding who deserves safe passage and who might be better suited for eternal guardianship. And once they've made their decision, there's no appeal process. There's no going back. There's only the endless duty of protecting trees that have stood since before human civilization began. Trees that will stand long after we're all gone. Unless, of course, we become part of their protection ourselves. Thanks for listening to these encounters from the deep woods. If you made it through all of these stories, you're either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both. These forests are still out there, still waiting, still watching for the next curious soul who thinks they understand the wilderness. Sweet dreams.